Don't let anybody make you think that God chose America as his divine messianic force to be a sort of policeman of the whole world. God has a way of standing before the nations with judgment, and it seems that I can hear God saying to America, you are too arrogant. And if you don't change your ways, I will rise up and break the backbone of your power.
Bow, 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 bow.
Hotep, which in the language of ancient Egypt means we come with justice in peace. Welcome to Freedom Now, a Saturday Pan-Africanist and Internationalist World Affairs program. Freedom Now is committed to the principle of the rights of all peoples and nations to self-determination. We thank you deeply for your contribution to KPFK, which permits programs like Freedom Now to stay on the air. In this era of corporate acquisition and co-optation of all dissident media, we provide the microphone, challenging their corporate and racist point of view. So stay tuned for Agenda here at Freedom Now.
Fellas, I'm ready to get up and do my thing. I want to get into it, man, you know.
Peace, hoteps, and wisdom to all of our faithful and devoted listeners out there in the radio verse. This is Brother Brandon Sankara, and I want to start things off with a thank you to all of you listeners out there who continue to support Freedom Now. You keep us on our mission and allow us to bring you our agenda for today, Saturday, November 30th, 2024. We begin with our dear ancestor and Freedom Now founder, Baba Didan Kamathi, bringing us the African drumbeat historical calendar for the week, reminding us that every day is a day in African history. After that, our very own treasure trove of wisdom, Dr. Gerald Horne, will be joined on the line by Matthew Connelly, Professor of International and Global History at Columbia University in New York City and author of the book, The Declassification Engine: What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets. Then, in the second half of our program, Dr. Horne will be joined on the line by María Hammack, Assistant Professor of History at The Ohio State University in Columbus, Ohio, and author of a recent paper for the Association for the Study of African American Life and History entitled Black Mexican Revolutionaries Who Anchored Freedom for Black Americans in the 19th Century Mexico. Now, I'm going to be on the ones and twos as we pour this knowledge, making sure your mental cup runneth over with revolutionary wisdom, right here to quench your mental thirst on Freedom Now, KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles, and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. To make sure that we stay on a smooth ride with that cultural vibe you know and love, we'll be enjoying a musical bottom featuring Cro-Magnon, Larry Coryell, Miles Davis, Art Blakey, McCoy Tyner, and Kareem Candy. Now, people, get ready for this train a-comin', taking you one step closer to mental liberation, and stay tuned for that beat of the historical drum, followed by an interview with Dr. Gerald Horne and Matthew Connelly.
Hotep. Hotep is an ancient Kemetic or Egyptian greeting meaning we come in peace and search for justice. This is the African drumbeat historical calendar is a direct challenge to the miseducation of the general population worldwide by the European imperialist education and media systems. This miseducation recently had many of you in the audience celebrating Thanksgiving, which from a Native American perspective is the national day of mourning or thanks-taking, due to the initiation of genocide by the Pilgrims. This imperialist system defines anti-colonial freedom fighters in Africa, Asia, Latin America, and the Caribbean as terrorists. So here at Freedom Now, we provide another point of view, the point of view of the oppressed masses of humanity seeking justice. We seek to generate critical thinking by providing another view of history. December 2nd, 1859, John Brown, who is considered the most controversial European in the 19th century, is hanged. He has been called the White Malcolm X. He was a European abolitionist with 20 children who organized armed struggle to free slaves and attempted to organize a liberation movement of slaves and abolitionists to overthrow the system of slavery. He was dissatisfied with the pacifism encouraged by the organized abolitionist movement. He reportedly said, "These men are all talk, what we need is action." During the Kansas campaign, he and his supporters killed 5 pro-slavery Southerners in what became known as the Potawatomi Massacre in May 1856. Brown's most famous deed was the 1859 raid he led on the Federal Armory at Harper's Ferry, Virginia, in modern-day West Virginia. During the raid, he seized the federal arsenal. 7 people, including a free African, were killed, and 10 or more were injured. He intended to arm slaves with weapons from the arsenal to lead a revolution against slavery, but the attack failed. December 3rd, International Day of the Disabled is proclaimed by the United Nations in 1992. Dignity and justice for all of us is the theme of this year's 2008 International Day for Persons with Disability, as well as for the 60th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Article 25 of the United Nations Declaration of Human Rights provides that each person has a right to security in the event of unemployment, sickness, disability, widowhood, old age, or other lack of livelihood in circumstances beyond their control. December 3rd, 1847, the North Star newspaper founded by Frederick Douglass and Martin Delany, taking as its motto, "Rights is of no sex, truth is of no color. God is the Father of us all. We are all brethren." The North Star served as a forum not only for abolitionist views, but also supported the feminist movement and emancipation of all oppressed groups. December 4th, 1969, Chicago Panther Fred Hampton, deputy chairman of the Black Panther Party, and Mark Clark killed by the Chicago police and the FBI. His assassination by COINTEL has been chronicled in the film The Murder of Fred Hampton. He was a pre-law major and headed the youth wing of the NAACP. With the founding of the Illinois chapter of the Black Panther Party, he quickly rose to leadership and successfully brokered a non-aggression pact between the major street gangs of Chicago. Hampton strove to forge a class-conscious, multiracial alliance between the Black Panther Party, the Students for Democratic Society, the Blackstone Rangers, the Puerto Rican Movement, the National Lords, and the Young Patriots. In May 1969, Hampton called a press conference to announce that a truce had been declared among this Rainbow Coalition, a phrase coined by Fred Hampton and made popular over the years by Jesse Jackson. December 5th, 1958, Osagyefo Kwame Nkrumah, the anti-colonial leader and first Prime Minister of Ghana, convenes the All-African People's Conference. This conference provided the first post-slavery, post-colonial conference of independent African nations, fulfilling Nkrumah's inaugural pledge that the independence of Ghana meant nothing as long as African people anywhere in the world were oppressed. This conference objective was to globally coordinate the decolonization and the de-necolonization of Africa and African people worldwide and the building of a United States of Africa, which, as a base, will provide a national homeland for Africans in the diaspora. Within a 10-year period since this conference, over 70% of African countries gained independence from colonialism. Today, the struggle is focused on neo-colonialism, whose graveyard will be in Africa. December 6, 1865, the 13th Amendment ratified, which abolishes slavery in the United States except for prison inmates. December 6, 1961, Franz Fanon, Pan-Africanist, Caribbean-born, French-educated staff psychologist for the French Colonial Army Division of Interrogation in Algeria, dies. Franz Fanon commits class suicide and rejects his role in the French Colonial Army and becomes a member of the National Liberation Front of Algeria and a prolific writer on the psychology of colonialism and the psychology of self-hate. His most famous book, The Wretched of the Earth, becomes the Bible of the psychology of the oppressed and oppressors, as well as his book, Black Skins, White Masks, which unmasks the cultural vampire nature of European colonial culture upon indigenous people. December 6, 1919, Malacora Aquino, revolutionary Filipino independence activist, crosses over. She was imprisoned for providing weapons, storage, and communications to the anti-Spanish resistance forces seeking to gain Philippines' independence. December 6, 1987, the first Palestinian national uprising, the Intifada, begins in the occupied West Bank and the Gaza Strips. 20 years later, the struggle against Zionism and for national liberation of Palestinian peoples occurs today unabashed. December 6, 1956, the modern Cuban Revolution under Fidel Castro and Che Guevara and the Cuban Communist Party begins. December 7, 1987, Libya, under the revolutionary leadership of Muammar Gaddafi, nationalizes the former British oil fields, setting into motion a decolonization of Libya and joins the rank of truly independent African nation, free not only from political control but European capitalist economic control. December 7, 1896, Antonio Machado, the Bronze Titan, dies. He was an African who was a soldier, statesman, and military strategist who led the Cuban Revolutionary Army that fought Spanish colonialism. Using alternately the tactics of guerrilla warfare and open warfare, they exhausted the Spanish army of more than 250,000 soldiers and traveled freely over Cuba. This has been the African Drumbeat Historical Calendar here at KPFK. We want to praise up our revolutionary ancestors who have made our present existence possible by hailing up the words of our Zanian South African brothers and sisters with Amandla Awetu, power to the people. We will repeat 3 times, Amandla Awetu.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne, and with me on the line is Matthew Connelly, Professor of International and Global History at Columbia University in New York City, and author of the book, The Declassification Engine: What History Reveals About America's Top Secrets. thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Matthew Connelly.
Oh, it's great to be with you.
And it's great to have you. So why did you write this book, The Declassification Engine?
Well, I set out to write a different book. I've long been fascinated with the way, people try to predict and prepare for catastrophic, even existential threats. And I was working with a team of students. We were starting with, plans, preparations for nuclear war. And, as soon as you start working on a subject like that, you find out a lot of what you want to know is classified. It's still redacted, or, the documents haven't been released even 50 or 100 years later. And so I started working with them on ways, that if we could get enough of these documents, we could start to make out patterns and anomalies, and figure out, not only what it is the government didn't want us to know, but maybe even why they didn't want us to know it.
And early in the book, you recount a vignette from the early United States in the early 1800s, when the authorities were quite concerned about the employment of Black postal workers because it was felt that they might gain access to confidential reports that could then serve to undermine enslavement of Africans. And I found that vignette very curious in light of the fact that today in the United States, you have, in a sense, an overrepresentation of Black people working in the post office. In fact, in the movie Hollywood Shuffle, the character is told that if he doesn't succeed in the film industry, he can always get a job at the post office. So I'm wondering, retrospectively, what you make of that vignette.
Yeah, so, it took me a while to make sense of it as well, because one thing that I think surprises most people, about the whole system that we've now become familiar with of trying to protect, so-called national security information, it seems so sprawling, and it's enormous. We have 18 different intelligence agencies and so on. So you might think it's a little bit like death and taxes, right? The governments are always secretive. But what I found, if you go back, the first 150 years of the American Republic, it was really quite unusual. In the way that the U.S. government, it really didn't have, a central intelligence agency of any kind. It didn't, typically intercept communications among its citizens the way that a lot of European governments did at the time. And, to look at the flip side, the U.S. government produced a lot of free information for the public. And one of the best examples is the U.S. Postal Service, the way it subsidized communications. It made it almost free, to deliver newspapers all over the country. But there is a huge exception to this, in a way a lot of your readers probably won't be surprised. That is when it came to certain communities, when it came, in fact, to the majority, of Americans who were not yet citizens at that point, at least not full citizens in the sense that they could, vote. And of course, for Black Americans, it was illegal for them, even to learn how to read. It was in many states, it was illegal to teach them. And that extended to delivering, the communications. So, Jefferson's postmaster, warned that if, they allowed Black Americans to deliver the news, that they would at least potentially form a kind of network, where they were going to be able to share information among themselves. And so early on, Jefferson signed legislation that made it impossible, for Black Americans to be postal carriers. So this is just one example of how, this country in the first 150 years of its existence, if anything, it was a kind of outlier. It really was not very secretive. It did not, in fact, try to withhold information. But that whole way of being was very different for the people in the U.S. who were not deemed to be free and equal.
Another vignette that caught my eye comes early in the book. In 1836, U.S. President Andrew Jackson was warned about the advisability of using Black men and women as servants because there might be confidential conversations they would overhear that could then be used to jeopardize U.S. national security. What do you make of that vignette?
Yeah, so it's in a way famous because people, quote from this because, Jackson would go on and talk about, how it is that if people wanted to read his mail, they were free to, if they wanted to read his notes, because he was a very bad speller, so he was in a way kind of making fun of himself. But it was actually deadly serious. And of course, Jackson could be very secretive. We only found out many years later some of his real estate dealings, where he was one of those who defrauded, indigenous peoples in the United States to take their property and make a lot of money from it. So, there was a kind of public story where, Jackson liked people to say, how open he was, how he'd speak his mind. He didn't care if, even his black servants listened in. But, the reality is, of course, Jackson was one of those, who used the control of information, to profit, profit for himself, and then also to disempower other people.
Now, moving into the 20th century, you also mentioned on page 68 that generally speaking, Mexican Americans were viewed as a, quote, security risk, unquote. I'm wondering why that was. Was it because it was felt that they had too close relationship to Mexico, a nation with which the United States often was at odds, or was there something else?
If there was, and we're talking now about the early days of the Manhattan Project, when they realized they were going to have to hire hundreds of thousands of people, to effectively work in secret, and trying to develop the weapons grade materials, whether uranium or plutonium. They were going to need to hire huge numbers of people. And this was at a time, when the US had some 12 million people in uniform. So there were real labor shortages. And so, it was because of that kind of desperation that they started to consider, employing large numbers of recent immigrants from Mexico. But you could tell too, how much the people in charge, like General Leslie Groves, they really didn't want to, and in part it was because of this, fear that, perhaps, Mexican Americans and Black Americans wouldn't be fully reliable. But what I found, Gerald, is that if you look at the data, what you find is that they were systematically, not just in the 1940s, but right up until recent history, U.S. authorities were much less likely to give security clearances, to people who are Black and brown. And they were also more likely to lose those clearances. One of the few studies of this from the Department of Energy, back when Hazel O'Leary became Secretary of Energy, they finally studied this, and they found, of course, that indigenous people and Mexican Americans and Black people are much more likely to lose their security clearances. And that's a whole can of worms unto itself. I hope we get time to talk about.
Yeah, that's an interesting point, because just anecdotally, as I think back about the Central Intelligence Agency agents and other intelligence officials who have sold secrets to real or imagined antagonists of the United States, they have rarely been Black or brown or indigenous. And I'm wondering if that ever dawned on the highest authorities.
Yeah, so, one thing you could say, and it wouldn't be, unfair, would be that there just weren't a lot of people who weren't white men, holding these kinds of secrets. And there are reasons for that. Like, one is, think about where and how you would get a security clearance. So for most of these jobs, it was the Federal Bureau of Investigation, that would carry out this kind of background check. They'd interview you, your family, your friends, your employers. Sometimes they even talk to your doctors, your psychiatrists. And until the 1970s, they didn't have a single Black agent. Like, they had a couple, but in fact, these were the valets for J. Edgar Hoover. He called them his agents, right? So just think of it. You have this group of thousands of people, and you didn't find, not only were there no Black FBI agents, there weren't even any women, right? So you have this remarkably homogenous kind of culture within the FBI. Even now, there's only one presidential appointee that is the head of the FBI. The rest of it is an agency that's remarkably insular. And so this was like the front line. If you weren't, a white man in America in the 1940s, 50s, 60s, 70s, you wanted to work, say, for the CIA or the Department of Energy, you had to pass muster with these sorts of people. And, it's no surprise, too, when you look at the kind of questions they would ask. So they would ask about, for instance, if somebody had ever been arrested, anybody ever had, any kind of financial problems. And of course, communities where you have disproportionately more people who are over-policed, people more likely to have student loan problems and so on, they're much more likely to raise red flags in this kind of process. And this continues right down to the present day.
Now, one of the more fascinating stories you tell, Professor Connelly, is on page 158, when you talk about a so-called war game that involves Cuba and Black Power advocates in the United States occupying Dixie. What was that all about?
Oh, I'm so glad you asked. This is one of the few documents that I got hold of when I first started researching this subject. It was a Pentagon war game. It was, I think, 1963, if I remember correctly. It was one of hundreds of Pentagon war games. And what they did was they tried to imagine future scenarios, like what kind of war might come about and how the United States would try to fight and win, these future wars. And what you found was that, in fact, very few of these have ever been declassified. This is one of the few. And it's just wild. Because basically, in 1963, when the Joint Chiefs of Staff, when they're imagining what future war would look like, basically they were imagining a race war. They're imagining, the defeat of the apartheid government in South Africa. They imagined like Cubans would invade, and together with Black Americans, they would overthrow the American government. They carry out lynchings on a large scale, in football stadiums. And when you read this, it's just mind-blowing, and it kind of makes you wonder, what about all the other stuff that they haven't declassified? They have not declassified a single, transcript or even, collection of notes, from the meetings of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. In fact, they don't even keep notes anymore. They destroyed all the ones up to that point, all the way back in 1974. So you have to wonder, like, if they got rid of all this stuff, even knowing, that people would have their suspicions, you have to wonder what it was that they didn't want us to know about. Maybe it was even worse, than the few examples that still survive.
Well, with regard to that latter point, that is to say, the U.S. military, the Joint Chiefs of Staff, deleting millions of reports and messages, as one of the few individuals who systematically has pored over JCS minutes and meetings and books and articles about same, are you able to speculate on what they may be afraid of revealing?
Well, what I find is, among the most sensitive subjects is, the whole question of civil-military relations. Because, in the United States, the U.S. military is meant to be answerable to elected officials, right? So ultimately, they're meant to be answerable to the American people. But when you find episodes like this, where they've systematically made it impossible, to hold them accountable, even decades later, where we can't get hold of any of the records of all of their many meetings, hundreds of meetings, you have to ask yourself, are they really accountable? I mean, even in the court of history. And there are a lot of other, examples that we get, sometimes not just from declassified documents, but just, the memoirs, the, what people will say after the fact. And you find examples where, for example, during the 1950s, Dwight Eisenhower pre-delegated the authority to initiate use of nuclear weapons, to local commanders, like people like the equivalent of, say, CENTCOM or the Supreme Commander of American forces in Europe. And even, the civilian officials who had top secret security clearances during the Kennedy administration, when they went around and tried to track down, if this was really true, over and over again, their military counterparts would just deny it, just lie through their teeth until they finally found, the smoking gun evidence. So, just think of it. If even people in the White House, even people with top secret security clearances, can't get to the truth of it. And when in this case, the Pentagon destroys their records and has been doing so systematically for decades, what hope is there for the rest of us really to know the whole story and to keep them accountable?
Finally, Professor Matthew Connelly, professor at Columbia University in New York City, author of the book, The Declassification Engine, you wrote an earlier book on Algeria. And in light of the fact that the Black Panther Party once had a legation in Algiers, do you have any tidbits to share about what you may have uncovered about the Black American role in Algeria during the period you study?
Well, I have to admit, Gerald, it wasn't the focus of my research. But I will say, over the years, I wrote that book about the history of the Algerian War. It was 20 years ago. But if anything, ever since then, I find people are even more interested now than they were then. Because, back then, certainly after they triumphed in 1962, Algiers became known as the Mecca of the Revolutionaries. And like you said, people, from the Black Panther movement, for example, they would go to Algiers, right? And not just them, like Nelson Mandela as well. In 1961, he traveled to FLN, or Front de Libération Nationale training camps, to try to learn what the Algerians had learned in fighting against the French and ultimately defeating them. So one of my favorite images in the book I wrote called Diplomatic Revolution is a picture of Mandela, with his counterparts in the Algerian rebel army. So yeah, Algeria really looms large, in this history of national liberation movements in this period. And, sadly, it wasn't just, revolutionaries who learned those lessons. The Algerians, after they defeated the French, some of these French officers became advisors, to their South African counterparts. They compared notes. And also some of the lessons of the Algerian War learned by some of these same French military thinkers ended up becoming influential in U.S. counterinsurgency doctrine. So the so-called COIN, manual and doctrine under David Petraeus, that owed a great deal, to a man named Galula, who was a French officer in Algeria. So these kinds of lessons, they can be learned by anyone, and they can be applied in all kinds of ways. That's why this history, I think, is still so important.
So important indeed, Professor Connelly. I'm afraid we're going to have to leave it there, but thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you so much, Gerald. Enjoyed being with you.
Ditto.
This is Sister Flora, and you are listening to Freedom Now at KPFK 90.7 FM in occupied Mexico, including Los Angeles, 98.7 FM Santa Barbara, 93.7 FM in San Diego, and streaming live on the web at kpfk.org. Today's program, as well as 10 prior editions, can be reheard at kpfk.org/audio archive, and scroll down to Freedom Now. From 12 to 1 p.m., following Freedom Now is your sister Assumpta, with Spotlight Africa addressing issues facing Mother Africa. For a truly alternative international perspective on world affairs, check out RTTV Russia, CCTV China, and online at Presna, Latina Cuba Telesur Venezuela, News 24 South Africa, and Press TV Iran. We will now continue with historian Professor Dr. Gerald Horne.
Welcome back. You're tuned in to Freedom Now on KPFK 90.7 FM in Los Angeles and kpfk.org, streaming live on the web. And we are going to keep this train a-moving, sending you back over to Dr. Gerald Horne, who's being joined now by Professor María Hammack. Take it away, Dr. Horne.
For KPFK Los Angeles, this is Gerald Horne. And with me on the line is María Esther Hammack, Assistant Professor of History at The Ohio State University and author of a recent paper at the Association for the Study of African American Life and History entitled Black Mexican Revolutionaries Who Anchored Freedom for Black Americans in 19th Century Mexico. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK Los Angeles, Professor Hammack.
Thank you so much for having me here today. I'm very excited to share a little bit of my work with you all, and thank you.
Well, you're quite welcome. So why did you write this paper on Black Mexican revolutionaries?
This paper came out of other investigations that I have been doing into the history or the roots of these freedom processes that we see later in the 19th century that enabled or allowed Black Americans to claim freedom in Mexican spaces. But I really wanted to look at how Black Mexicans had shaped the revolutionary movement and how they have and who had the leading roles in crafting processes for freedom in Mexican spaces. And so that is where this paper comes from, me digging into the archives and trying to figure out, who are the Black revolutionaries leading that independence movement beyond what we've been told, for instance, as a Mexican citizen, we all know Miguel Hidalgo y Costilla, right? But little or seldom do we know about some of the individuals that are highlighted in that paper, like Ciriaco Cruz, Pedro Rojas, Marcelo Valero, and Isidoro Montes de Oca. And so I wanted to bring them to light in this paper.
Mm-hmm. Now, with regard to Mexico, what would you say were the sites that were most receptive to accepting Black American exiles? What does Matamoros, Veracruz, Mexico City, Guadalajara? Tell us about that.
That's a phenomenal question, and one of the leading questions that I began with, like where did people go? Where did people claim freedom? And what I found was both, not surprising, but certainly very revealing. A lot of the times we tend to think that Black Americans went to, enclaves or Black communities already established, and certainly they did. We have a lot of people trying to reach places like Veracruz, like Matamoros, as you mentioned, the border areas. We have, communities that continue to remain today that are part of those Black communities, like El Nacimiento de los Negros. But what I found throughout the work that I've been doing and the research that I've done in the past 7 years now, I've come to recognize that people were going to any place, any space where they could themselves claim freedom. Sometimes they will go into those already established communities, but a lot of the times they would go to cities where they could blend in, where they can find work, crafting their own, what I argue, channels of liberation across Mexican spaces. They could be cities, they could be towns, wherever they could find work and establish themselves.
Is it fair to infer that a city like Veracruz, which had a pre-existing Black population, was more receptive of all of the sites in Mexico to which Black people fled?
Absolutely, yes. I think that is very safe to infer. And certainly people were reaching places like Veracruz. They were, often getting on boats in New Orleans, for instance, or in other ports in Texas, in Galveston, Brazoria, and trying to, and making it to Veracruz. They were also making it to Tamaulipas, to Tampico, for instance. And so, yes, a lot of the like Veracruz comes as a place where people regularly were reaching, as well as Campeche, for instance.
Mm-hmm. And what role does gender play in your pages?
Gender comes to be very important in the work that I've been doing, particularly in the research. And I think it also comes from the awareness or the lens that I have. And I guess I'll tell you a little bit about how I came to this work. I was sitting in a class. I did my undergraduate at this small university in Eastern North Carolina, East Carolina University. And I was sitting in a class that was a required course about the history of the Old South. And in that class, we were talking about Harriet Tubman and the Underground Railroad. And at that moment, being a recent immigrant, I really didn't know much about this history. But coming from Mexico, all I knew was that Mexico had abolished slavery about 30 years before. And so when my professor, David Denard, was talking about Harriet Tubman, I raised my hand and I asked him if he knew who was the Harriet Tubman who led people to Mexico, and if he could tell me how many people went to Mexico. And he looked at me and he said, that's a very good question, Maria. If you find out, let me know. And so every time I passed by his office, he would ask me, what have you found out? What have you found out? And then I began to research. And so when I began to research for who were the Harriet Tubmans who were leading this pathway south. And so with that lens, I think that when I was in the archive across the United States or in Mexico, I was always looking for women. And I was always looking for how they fared, how they engineered liberation, how they claimed their freedom. And, I wanted to learn about their experiences and that, what I argue is that lucha, that fight So I began to see them in the archive, and there are scholars who are, for instance, in the old traditional scholarship, a lot of the times we hear these, which I think now is a theory, that Black women didn't run away as much as Black men, or didn't escape slavery as much as men because of children or family. But what I have found in the records, in the archives, is that women were likely running away either as much as men, or maybe perhaps more. But I have found the women in the archives. I have found them running away. I have found them not only claiming their freedom, but assisting others, family members, neighbors, kin, to claim their freedom as well. I have this woman that I found that escaped French Louisiana and went into early San Antonio in the 1790s. And she not only claimed her freedom, but she was, according to her former enslaver, saying by word of mouth and in writing, that's what the former enslaver said, this woman was helping or coercing his slaves to run away to where she was. And so you start seeing women, and you start seeing how, even in spite of the hardships or the hard terrain or the impossibilities of those journeys, women were very much in those records, were very much present, and creating not only those channels to liberation, but in Mexican spaces, they were also creating and fomenting community, establishing there. And so that is part of like the gender comes through or has come through for me as I mined the archive.
So was there any difference in terms of sites of exile in Mexico of Black women versus Black men as they're fleeing south? I mean, were Black women more likely to settle in Matamoros than Black men, for example?
I don't necessarily think it was that women were settling in certain spaces more than men. I think that what I have found is that when you look for the women, and when you find the women, you find the children, you find the men, you find the families. And so it has broadened that perspective of who's there, and you do see them. And sometimes, for instance, you find the men, and the men are also making sure that the women are have possibilities, or that they are reunited with their wives and children. We have this man who had managed to run away and escape twice because he had been kidnapped and brought back to the U.S., and he managed to escape a second time. And when he got freed again, when he reached Mexican spaces again, he actually said, "I'm here. I want to make sure that, I know that Mexican law offers protections, and I've heard that there's freedom that it can be claimed here. I want to make sure that I get those protections, but I also want to make sure that I get assistance to bring my wife and my family." And so in those instances, I think that the importance of this lens is to understand that they were there. If you find the men, you find the women. If you find the women, you find the families as well.
So talk to us about Vicente Guerrero. Who was he, and what role does he play?
So Vicente Guerrero was an Afro-Mexican general leader. He was one of the leaders of the Mexican Revolution against the Spanish. He was, a lot of us grow up learning about him. He was an insurgente. He was a man who fought not only for the freedom of Mexico, but he was the first Black Mexican to be the president of Mexico. And we like to say that because we've had several. We also had, oh my goodness, in the 1850s we had another Afro-Mexican president as well. That escapes me. His name escapes me right now. But Vicente Guerrero also passed the abolition of slavery on September 15th of 1829, that abolished slavery in the nation, where in the newly established independent Republic of Mexico. And so his significance is immeasurable, and I think that there is today a gap in fully recognizing and acknowledging his significance, and not only in the history of Mexico, but in the history of Black liberation in North America. A lot of the times when we talk or have conversations about liberation in the Americas, seldom do we get to talk about Vicente Guerrero or Black Mexicans in those conversations. And I think that in order to better understand Black liberation, Mexico has to be part of that conversation, the efforts and the struggles and the contributions and legacies of Black Mexicans.
So certain historians have suggested that when Guerrero led the struggle to abolish enslavement of Africans in Mexico, that the then Mexican province known as Tejas or Texas took umbrage at this and decided to secede from Mexico and form an independent state, and later join the United States of America, where it presently resides. Is that a thesis that you find substantive?
I have done some research in this, the province of Texas, and from the vantage point of the congressional records in Mexico and what was going on, since the independence was secured in 1821, there were a lot of, as we know, changes in power and in governments. We had a constitutional monarchy. We had Iturbide, and then that failed. So there's a lot of changes in powers. But ever since Mexico secured independence, freedom, particularly the end of chattel slavery, was something that was on the agenda for particularly for Black Mexicans, but for all Mexicans, most Mexicans in the Congress, except for there were some factions who didn't want that. That's where some of these factions were individuals who were coming from other places who were hoping to settle in Texas. Anglo-Americans were coming in, trying to get land grants. A lot of them, like Stephen F. Austin, ended up getting land grants, recertified by the newly established Mexican government. And even though in these early years, like 1823, 24, 25, they were still in the process of establishing, their government, they hadn't really abolished slavery, but they had passed certain decrees and laws or stipulations that made it very clear that Mexico was in the process, that this new government, whatever it may end up being, was in the process of abolishing slavery. And so as soon as these land grants were issued, Anglo-Americans started establishing themselves in Texas and bringing in enslaved people from the United States mostly. This was something that Mexico did not want. They wanted to get rid of slavery, and so they ended up passing the abolition of slavery in Mexico on July 13th of 1824, saying that from that day forward, no one is supposed to bring any more people that were enslaved into Mexican territory, including Texas. And so this caused a lot of animosity with those Texas settlers who wanted to get exemptions from that law, but they did not get the exemptions from the abolition of the international slave trade, the abolition of the international slave trade law. And so what they ended up doing is they conceived their own contract system, this inveigling system, where they would introduce people, and not as enslaved people per se, but with contracts that claimed that they were servants for 90 years or 100 years. And so in a way that they could, as Dr. Quinter Taylor argues, they were subterfuge for slavery. And they were very much recognized by the Mexican government as such. They were saying, we know that these contracts are basically subterfuge, and we know that they're bringing people enslaved, And all through these years, between 1824 and 1829, and through the early 30s, they tried to find ways to stop that illegal importation of enslaved people into the Texas province. Now, when Mexico decided to abolish slavery, when Vicente Guerrero issued the decree in 1829, the Texas settlers began to rebel, and they sent some envoys to Mexico City to say, hey, we need to have an exception for that law. And because at that moment, Mexico was in many ways not in the best situation to handle a war or a rebellion, they did give the Texas province an exception. And this exception came, so the abolition of slavery was passed on September of 1829. By December, the Mexican government had given the Texas slaveholders an exception, but it was an exception that came with very specific stipulations. And some of the stipulations basically said that they were exempt from the law for a period of 10 years, and nobody else that was born in the country would be considered a slave, and the children that were already there had to be freed within a certain period of time. They had to be educated, they had to be given all these provisions, and there was like a list of provisions that they had to do. And of course, they were not, the Texas settlers were not very amenable to that compromise per se, to that exemption, because the exemption came with those stipulations. And the Mexican governments, thought that that would appease, the exemption would appease the Texas settlers, but as we all know, it did not. The rebellion still happened, Texas still rebelled and broke away from the rest of Mexico on the basis of that issue of slavery and Texas hold to the institution.
Mm-hmm. Finally, Professor Hammack, Assistant Professor of History at The Ohio State University, we understand that you have a forthcoming book dealing with many of these issues you've discussed in recent minutes. What is the title of that book, and when can your audience expect it?
So the title of my book is Channels of Liberation, Freedom Fighters in the Age of Abolitions, and it's tentatively coming in the next couple of years. I am working with Penn Press on this book, and I am also very hopeful that it is ready and to go out in the next couple of years.
Well, we look forward with eager anticipation to that book. Professor Hammack, Assistant Professor at The Ohio State University, author of a recent paper at the annual convention of the Association for the Study of African American Life and History. Thank you for joining us on Freedom Now, KPFK, Los Angeles.
Thank you.
You're listening to the text of a letter I wrote to the newspaper Workers' World while I was on death row. The sickening attacks on gay people in cities across the nation recently is a reflection of the sickness that simmers at the core of the American soul. It is here that a truly perverse hatred is bred, and from here that all attacks are launched against all who are seen as other. This violence, which seems psychosexual in nature, is an attack on the self. that seeks to destroy a part of the self, that threatens the self. From Matthew Shepard to Alabama, to that bloody American ground that was once the seat of the American Confederacy, Richmond, violence spawned by the dark pit of hatred and fear is unleashed by men who claim a false and twisted purity. More often than not, those who find themselves attacking gay folks violently are replaying a violence that they grew up with or that they continue to act out of against their family or children. Is it a coincidence that Richmond, the city where a black man was burned to death and decapitated, is followed several months later with the decapitation and torture of a gay man? I think not. This cruel and savage violence must be stopped, but it won't be the cops that stop it, for they are the agents of legalized state violence. The brutality that occurs in their own homes daily. The recent spate of cops who kill their wives and kids more than proves that. The people are the solution. So my thanks to the Rainbow, on the move to freedom. Free the Move 9. This is Mumia Abu Jamal.
In closing, we'd like to thank our guest, Matthew Connelly from Columbia University, as well as María Hammack from The Ohio State University. Shout out to Dr. Gerald Horne for doing what he does best and guiding this train of mental liberation towards Pan-African enlightenment for yet another Saturday. Word to producer Sister Tej. Special thanks to our spiritual backbone and Freedom Now founder and ancestor Baba Didan Kamathi. Abundant thanks to our marvelous engineer, and last but certainly not least, thanks to all of our loyal listeners and supporters. It takes a village to build a revolution, and Freedom Now is a village to be reckoned with. This has been Brother Brandon Sankara, and you can join us on Facebook at Freedom Now Gerald Horne. You can email the program at freedomnow@kpfk.org, or go to our audio archives on kpfk.org and scroll down to Freedom Now, and you'll be able to hear this program as well as 60 days worth of prior programming here at KPFK 90.7 FM. We now send you off to our sister Assumpta with Spotlight Africa coming up next, addressing issues facing Mama Africa. And until next Saturday, here at Freedom Now, we stand running our marathon, ready for revolution.
We state these facts only to let you know that those of us who are revolutionary, Pan-Africanists, is not because we love revolution. It is historically determined, and we have no alternative but to follow history and to use history for the benefit of our people.